You're a burden, Mom. This place can take better care of you than I ever could. My son said those words without looking me in the eye as he parked outside Rosewood Senior Living on a gray Thursday morning in October. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands folded tightly over my handbag, staring at the cheerful sign surrounded by trimmed hedges and artificial kindness. Rosewood Senior Living. Compassion. Comfort. Community. What a polished lie. His wife, Vanessa, turned slightly from the back seat, her perfume sharp enough to sting. This is really for the best, Eleanor. You'll have people your own age. Activities. Nurses. It's honestly better than rattling around that big house alone. That big house. The same house I'd spent 38 years building with my husband, Daniel. The house where I raised my son. The house where I held my breath through overdue bills, where I worked double shifts at a diner so he could have braces, baseball cleats, and eventually a college degree. I nodded once. Slowly. Not because I agreed. Because at 72, I had finally learned that silence unsettled cruel people more than tears ever could. I opened the car door carefully, my arthritis protesting in my knees. The autumn wind cut through my coat as I stepped onto the curb. My son, Jason, popped the trunk and set my 2 suitcases beside me. 2 suitcases. Apparently, that was all my life amounted to now. I'm glad you're here, I said softly to you, dear listener. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because by the time my son understood what burden really meant, it was far too late. Jason cleared his throat. Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder. I almost smiled. Hard was burying Daniel after 41 years of marriage. Hard was learning how to sleep alone in a bed built for 2. Hard was signing insurance papers while still wearing black from the funeral. This was clarity. I looked at my son then, really looked at him. At the expensive watch on his wrist I'd helped pay for when he got his first corporate job. At the polished shoes standing on the pavement, while mine trembled slightly from age and heartbreak. For one brief second I searched for the little boy who used to run into my arms after nightmares. He was gone. In his place stood a man who had let his wife convince him that the mother who gave him everything was now an inconvenience. Vanessa gave me that tight smile. The kind people wear when they want credit for cruelty dressed as concern. We'll visit soon, she said. We all knew that was a lie. A young staff member in lavender scrubs opened the front door and offered me a practiced smile. Mrs. Carter? We're ready for you. Ready for me. As though I were expected. As though this had all been arranged neatly, like I was simply checking into a hotel instead of being quietly erased from my own life. I reached down, lifted my handbag, and placed one hand on my suitcase. Then I finally spoke. Thank you, Jason, I said calmly. His shoulders relaxed too quickly. He thought this was surrender. He had no idea that the next morning, I would go to the bank. The room they gave me was smaller than my kitchen pantry back home. A narrow bed with a floral bedspread. One wooden dresser with brass handles scratched by decades of strangers. A single window overlooking the parking lot, where family members dropped off their aging responsibilities and drove away lighter. Room 214. That number sat on the door like a quiet sentence. I stood there for a long moment after the nurse left, my 2 suitcases beside me, listening to the silence. Not true silence. Muted television from somewhere down the hall. A cough. A wheelchair squeaking over tile. Soft voices carrying the strange cheerfulness people use in places where sadness has overstayed its welcome. I set my handbag on the bed and ran my fingers over the quilt. It smelled like bleach and lavender spray. Not home. Home smelled like cinnamon in winter. Lemon polish on old wood floors. Daniel's coffee brewing at 5:30 every morning for nearly 4 decades. My chest tightened, but I didn't cry. Grief had changed shape since Daniel died 6 months ago. At first, it had been sharp. Like broken glass. Now it was heavier. Colder. Like carrying a house on my back only to realize no one inside was waiting for me anymore. I opened my suitcase slowly. Vanessa had packed most of it. 3 cardigans. 2 pairs of sensible shoes. My blood pressure pills. A framed photograph of Daniel, though I noticed she'd chosen the smaller one from his retirement dinner instead of our wedding portrait. Interesting. Even in exile, she was editing my life. I placed Daniel's photo on the nightstand carefully. "There you are," I whispered. His familiar smile, steady, kind, impossible to replace, stared back at me. For a moment, I was back in our old bedroom, sitting on the edge of the mattress while he rubbed my shoulders after late shifts at Miller's diner. "We protect what we build, Ellie," he used to say. At the time, I thought he meant the house. Now, standing in room 214 with institutional carpet beneath my orthopedic shoes, I wondered if he'd meant something more. A soft knock interrupted me. "Lunch is in 30 minutes, honey," said a petite woman with silver curls and bright lipstick from across the hall. "First day's the hardest. I'm Dorothy." I smiled politely. "Eleanor." Her eyes softened in that way only women our age understand. Not pity. Recognition. "They told me my son was too busy," she said, leaning lightly on her walker. "Funny how busy they get when property values go up." Then she shuffled away before I could answer. I sat down hard on the bed. Property values. My gaze drifted to the manila folder the admissions director had handed Jason earlier. He'd signed papers quickly. Too quickly. "Just standard care documents, Mom." At the time, my grief had been too fresh. My trust too automatic. But Daniel had handled our finances for years, and before he passed, he made me promise something. "Never sign what you don't read. Not even for family." Family? I looked around that tiny room again, at the half-packed suitcase and parking lot view. Then I reached for my purse. Inside, beneath tissues and mints, was my checkbook, and the spare key to the filing cabinet in Daniel's study. Vanessa thought she packed my clothes. Jason thought he dropped off a burden. Neither of them remembered that before I was a mother, I was Daniel Carter's wife. And Daniel never left anything important unprotected. That night I barely slept. Rosewood was quiet. In the way hospitals are quiet. Not peaceful. Just padded. Like grief itself had been carpeted to keep it from making too much noise. Every few hours, footsteps passed my door. Nurses checking medications. A distant call bell. Someone crying out in confusion before being soothed back into silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, tracing tiny cracks with my eyes, and for the first time in 72 years, I began replaying things I should have questioned sooner. Jason insisting I take a break after Daniel's funeral. Vanessa offering to help organize paperwork. The sudden urgency about downsizing. The way my mail had slowly stopped arriving directly to me. At the time, I thought they were helping. Because that's what mothers do. We translate discomfort into loyalty. We excuse what should alarm us because admitting betrayal from your own child feels worse than any lie. By morning, I was dressed before sunrise. Navy cardigan. Sensible slacks. Pearl earrings Daniel gave me on our 25th anniversary. If I was going to uncover what my son had done, I would do it looking like the woman who built that life, not the burden they left behind. Dorothy spotted me near the lobby payphone after breakfast. "You look like a woman about to either escape or start a war," she said, balancing a tray of oatmeal and toast. "Maybe both," I replied. For the first time since arriving, I meant my smile. Rosewood had computers for residents, but I didn't need one. I needed something older. More reliable. Franklin National Bank. Daniel and I had banked there for 41 years. Back when handshakes still meant something. I used the courtesy shuttle that took residents to medical appointments on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I told the receptionist I needed to review some financial matters. That part, at least, was true. The young driver made polite conversation, but my mind was elsewhere. Back in Daniel's study? The locked filing cabinet. The late nights he spent updating documents after his heart diagnosis. "Just in case," he'd said. At the bank, the marble floors gleamed exactly as I remembered. The same brass lamps. The same walnut desks. And by some grace I hadn't expected, Margaret Ellis was still there. Branch manager. 60-ish. Sharp as a tack. Played bridge with me twice back in 2009. Her expression changed the moment she saw me. Eleanor? I thought. Jason said you were relocating permanently? There it was. Not concern. Assumption. I folded my gloves carefully and sat across from her. I need copies of every signature card, deed transfer, and account authorization changed in the last 6 months. Margaret didn't move right away. She just looked at me. Really looked. Then her professional smile disappeared. Eleanor, did you authorize your son as primary power of attorney? The room didn't spin. I didn't gasp. I simply felt something inside me go still. The kind of stillness that comes right before ice breaks. No, I said. One word. Quiet. Clean. Final. Margaret inhaled slowly, then turned her monitor toward herself. I think, she said carefully, you need to see this. As paper after paper slid across that polished desk, my hands remained steady. Property access revisions. Joint account restructuring. Withdrawal authorizations. And there, on legal forms tied to my house, my signature. Or something meant to look like it. Vanessa always did have neat handwriting. By the time I finished reading, one truth had settled cold and certain in my chest. My son hadn't sent me to Rosewood because I was a burden. He sent me there because I was in the way. I should have cried. That would have been the normal response, I suppose? A trembling hand over my mouth. Tears in a polished bank office. The shattered sound of a mother realizing her own son had helped forge her name. But grief had already done its worst to me when I buried Daniel. This was mathematics. Fraud. Timing. Motive. I sat there in Franklin National Bank, reviewing page after page while Margaret quietly highlighted dates. 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral, Jason had been added to my checking account. 2 weeks later, power of attorney paperwork had been filed. 1 month after that, preliminary home equity inquiries had been made. Not by me. By Vanessa. The pattern was so clean it almost impressed me. They hadn't acted out of panic. They had planned. I thought back to those weeks. After Daniel passed. The casseroles from church friends. Sympathy cards. My sleeplessness. The heavy fog grief wrapped around everything. Vanessa had stepped in constantly. Don't worry about bills, Eleanor. I'll organize the mail. You shouldn't stress over paperwork right now. Just sign here so Jason can help if there's an emergency. I had trusted her because I was tired. Because mourning makes you vulnerable in ways youth never understands. And Jason, my sweet little boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a sparrow. He had sat beside me at the kitchen table and watched me sign documents without reading them. Not all of them, apparently. Because some I had never seen before. Margaret's voice was careful. There's more. She slid over a property transfer draft. Incomplete, but active. My house. My home. The white colonial on Maple Grove with the wraparound porch Daniel built one summer by hand. They were preparing to sell it. I stared at the paperwork, and suddenly I was no longer in the bank. I was 34 years old again, standing barefoot in our unfinished living room, holding blueprints while Jason, age 6, ran through sawdust pretending to be a superhero. Daniel had wrapped his arms around me from behind and whispered, "One day this house keeps you safe, even when I can't." I nearly broke then. Not because of what Jason had done, but because Daniel had tried to protect me, and I had almost let grief hand his life's work to people who saw it as square footage. "Can we stop this?" I asked. Margaret's answer came without hesitation. "Yes. But Eleanor, if signatures were forged, this may require legal action." Legal action? Against my own son. The words should have felt impossible. Instead, they felt necessary. I folded my gloves over the papers and sat up straighter. For 42 years I stood by one good man, I said quietly. I did not survive widowhood just to be robbed by the boy I raised. Margaret gave the smallest nod. Not sympathy. Respect. By noon, we had frozen key account movements. Flagged suspicious document changes. Requested full copies. And before I left, I made one more call. Harold Bennett. Daniel's attorney. Semi-retired. Sharp-minded. Hated dishonesty almost as much as Daniel did. When his familiar gravelly voice answered, I didn't waste time. Harold, I said, staring out at the parking lot where my son once learned to drive. It's Eleanor Carter. A pause. Then, what did they do? I closed my eyes. Because that one sentence told me something I hadn't been ready to admit. Daniel must have seen this coming, before I ever did. Harold Bennett's office smelled exactly the same. Leather-bound law books. Black coffee. Cedar polish. For a moment, stepping inside felt like walking backward through time, to charity galas, estate meetings, and summer barbecues where Harold and Daniel argued about baseball on the back porch while I refilled iced tea. Except this time, Daniel wasn't there. And I wasn't planning a future. I was protecting what remained of one. Harold looked older, of course. More silver than brown in his hair. Reading glasses lower on his nose. But his eyes were still sharp enough to cut through nonsense before it finished speaking. He read every page Margaret had printed. Twice. The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking down each second of my old life. Finally, Harold removed his glasses. Well, he said, voice flat with contained anger. Your husband was smarter than I realized. I frowned. What does that mean? Without a word, he reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. My name. Daniel's handwriting. My breath caught. In the months before his illness worsened, Daniel updated everything, just in case grief clouded judgment. Harold said. Told me not to open it unless he was gone, and unless you ever came to me because you believed Jason or Vanessa had manipulated you. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Daniel knew. Or at least, he feared enough to prepare. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. Ellie, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and something doesn't feel right. I pray I was wrong. But if I wasn't, remember this, I built safeguards, not because I doubted you, but because grief makes good people trust the wrong hands. Check the Maple Grove deed. Check the family trust. And whatever happens, do not let guilt make you gentle with betrayal. By the time I reached the last line, my vision blurred. Not from weakness. From the unbearable ache of being loved so well by one man, and betrayed so deeply by another. Harold slid a second folder toward me. The house, he said, is not legally transferable without conditions your son clearly doesn't understand. I looked up. What conditions? Harold's jaw tightened, and for the first time that day, I smiled. Daniel had placed Maple Grove, several investments, and the majority of our estate into an irrevocable family trust. Controlled by me. Not Jason. And buried in its clauses was something even more important. Any beneficiary proven to manipulate, coerce, or financially exploit the surviving spouse would forfeit their inheritance immediately. I stared at him. Jason hadn't just tried to remove me. He had triggered his own disinheritance. Vanessa, with all her careful lists and forged signatures, had been playing checkers on a chessboard Daniel built. Can they still fight this? I asked. Harold leaned back slowly. They can try, he said. But Eleanor, your husband left very specific instructions. He tapped the trust. If fraud occurred, we don't just stop the sale. His expression turned cold. We become the burden. For the first time since Rosewood's doors closed behind me, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt armed. And when I returned to room 214 that evening, Dorothy took one look at my face over dinner and raised an eyebrow. Well? She asked. I picked up my spoon calmly. My husband, I said softly, may have just saved me from the son we raised. Then I tasted the soup. Still terrible. But somehow, everything else was getting better. The next morning, I did exactly what Jason expected me to do. Nothing. I attended chair yoga at 9 o'clock. Smiled politely through blood pressure checks at 10:30. Folded napkins during creative enrichment hour. At noon, while a volunteer named Brenda explained decoupage like she was unveiling nuclear science. I played the part beautifully. Confused widow. Quiet mother. Harmless resident of room 214. By day 3, even Rosewood staff had relaxed around me. Good. Because invisibility, I was learning, could be useful. Vanessa called that Thursday afternoon. I let it ring twice before answering. Hi, Eleanor, she chirped, her voice coated in artificial sweetness. Just checking in. How are you settling? Eleanor. Not Mom. Never Mom. I glanced at Dorothy, who was pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. Oh, I'm adjusting, I said softly. It's been such a big change. I'm just grateful you and Jason found somewhere manageable. Dorothy nearly choked on her pudding. Vanessa exhaled, relieved. Exactly as planned? That's wonderful, she said. We know this is best. Best. Funny word. By the way, she added too casually, there are still a few property documents we may need your signature on. Nothing urgent. Just housekeeping. Housekeeping. There it was. Not guilt. Not concern. Paperwork. I lowered my voice, added just enough fragility to make her careless. Oh, of course, dear. You always were so good with those things. Just bring whatever I need. Hook. Line. Sinker. When I hung up, Dorothy stared openly. You sound a lot sharper than a woman headed for bingo. I smiled and took a slow sip of weak coffee. Daniel always said if someone thinks you're powerless, let them. That afternoon, Harold arrived at Rosewood carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of expression men wear before courtrooms or funerals. We sat in the private family lounge beneath an aggressively cheerful painting of sunflowers. He laid out the plan carefully. Vanessa would bring forged or cursive paperwork. We would document everything. A forensic handwriting specialist was already reviewing prior signatures. Margaret had flagged suspicious transfers. And Harold had quietly filed legal holds against any sale or refinancing tied to Maple Grove. In other words, the trap was no longer theirs. It was ours. Eleanor, Harold said, folding his hands. Once they realize the trust overrides their plans, they may panic. Good, I replied. He studied me for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Daniel would have been proud of you. That nearly broke me. Not because I doubted it, but because I had spent months feeling like grief had turned me fragile, when in truth, it had simply burned away my illusions. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn sunlight. Jason and Vanessa came together. Flowers. Smiles. Pastries from that overpriced bakery Vanessa loved posting online. A performance. My son kissed my cheek. Too quickly. Vanessa set a folder on the side table with manicured precision. Just a few final forms, she said brightly. This will make everything easier. Easier. I adjusted my reading glasses slowly. No trembling hands. No confusion. Just Eleanor Carter, widow of Daniel Carter, reading every word. And there it was. Durable power revisions. Expanded property authority. Permanent residential consent. Not one of them designed to help me. Every single one designed to erase me legally. I looked up at my son. Really looked. At the little boy I once protected from thunderstorms. Now sitting across from me, hoping I'd sign myself out of my own life. So I smiled gently. Then I said the one thing neither of them expected. Oh, sweetheart, before I sign anything. I placed Harold's business card on top of the folder. My attorney has a few questions first. The silence after I placed Harold's business card on the folder was so complete, even Rosewood's hallway noise seemed to disappear. Jason blinked first. Not because he didn't understand what he was seeing. Because he understood it immediately. Vanessa, however, recovered faster. She laughed. A light, polished little sound. The kind women like her use when they think charm can still outrun consequences. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, sliding the card aside with one manicured finger. "There's really no need to complicate this. These are standard forms." Standard. I almost admired her nerve. Across from them, I folded my hands neatly in my lap. "Then you won't mind if Harold reviews them?" Jason shifted in his seat. A tiny movement. But mothers notice tiny things. The jaw tightening. The shoulder tension. The same look he had when he was 12 and lying about breaking Daniel's fishing reel. Only this time, he wasn't hiding a broken tool. He was hiding betrayal. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice like I was being difficult. "Harold's old-fashioned. Vanessa and I are just trying to simplify things so we can manage the house while you're here." "While you're here. Not until you come home. Not while you recover. Just here. Temporary for me. Permanent for them." I picked up the paperwork again, slowly enough to make them uncomfortable. "I noticed that," I said. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. And I adjusted my glasses. "And I noticed these forms classify me as mentally diminished in financial decision-making." Jason went pale. Actually pale. "Oh, that's just procedural language," Vanessa began. "No," I said quietly. One word. Sharp enough to stop her cold. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, my voice sounded like my own again. "Procedural," I continued, "would be helping me pay bills. This," I tapped the page once, "is an attempt to remove legal authority from a competent woman using manipulated residency status." Vanessa's expression flickered. There it was. The first crack. Jason rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, nobody's trying to hurt you." And that was the sentence that finally killed whatever innocence I still wanted to preserve. Because people planning to protect you don't forge signatures. They don't classify you as incapable. And they certainly don't move you into room 214 while preparing to liquidate your home. I reached into my handbag and calmly removed copies Harold had prepared. Bank timestamps. Trust clauses. Flag transfers. I set them on the table one by one. Not dramatically. Methodically. Like setting a dinner table for truth. Vanessa stopped smiling first. Jason stopped breathing normally second. I went to Franklin National. I said. My son's face changed in a way I will never forget. Not anger. Not shame. Fear. Real fear. "Mom," he whispered. "No," I replied. "You called me a burden. So let me lighten your load." Then I slid Daniel's trust clause across to him. The forfeiture section. I watched my son's eyes move left to right. Watched understanding arrive. Any beneficiary found guilty of coercion, fraud, or financial exploitation against the surviving spouse forfeits all inheritance. All. The color drained from Vanessa's face. So quickly it was almost impressive. "You set us up?" she snapped. "Us. Not him. Us." And there it was. Not family. A partnership. A strategy. A plan. I stood carefully, arthritis and all, but somehow taller than I'd felt in months. "No," I said, picking up my purse. "My husband protected me." Harold stepped into the room right on cue. Precise as ever. And when Jason looked at him, panicked and stammering, Harold didn't raise his voice. He simply opened his briefcase and said, "Mr. Carter, before your mother pursues criminal fraud charges." He paused. "You may want to read what your father really left you." For the first time since they abandoned me at Rosewood, my son looked exactly like what he was. Not powerful. Not practical. Not burdened. Just caught. Jason read the clause 3 times. I know because I counted. His lips moved slightly on certain words, the way they used to when he was little and sounding out difficult sentences at our oak kitchen table. Only now, the difficult words were his own undoing. Fraud. Coercion. Immediate forfeiture. Across from him, Vanessa had gone unnaturally still. Not graceful stillness. Strategic stillness. The kind predators use when they're calculating whether denial or escape has better odds. This is ridiculous, she said finally, though her voice had lost its shine. You can't seriously believe we were trying to sell my home? I asked. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. Harold calmly slid the preliminary property inquiry, the forged authorization forms, and bank flags closer to them. Attempted liquidation of trust-protected assets, he corrected. With falsified or misrepresented consent. Jason looked like he might be sick. Good. Not because I wanted my son destroyed. But because consequences should feel heavier than convenience. Dad wouldn't do this, he muttered. That sentence. More than the forged papers. More than Rosewood. More than being called a burden. That sentence cut deepest. Because Daniel had done exactly this. Not out of cruelty. Out of foresight. Harold's voice was calm enough to freeze fire. Your father did. In fact, Daniel Carter amended the trust after expressing concerns that grief might impair your mother's judgment, particularly under outside influence. Outside influence. Vanessa flinched. There it was again. Another crack. You mean me? She snapped. Harold didn't blink. If the paperwork fits. Dorothy, bless that woman, later claimed she nearly applauded from the hallway. Jason stood abruptly. This is insane. We were trying to help. I looked at him then, not as the boy I raised, but as the man he had chosen to become. Helping, I said softly, would have been asking what I wanted. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Because there was no defense for bypassing dignity. No excuse for replacing a mother's voice with paperwork. Vanessa tried one final pivot, the wounded victim. We gave up so much to care for you. I almost laughed. Care for me? They packed 2 suitcases. Dropped me at Rosewood. Then drafted legal incapacity forms before my side of the bed had even gone cold. No, I said. You gave up nothing. You were trying to gain everything. Silence. Clean. Hard. Undeniable. Harold adjusted his cufflinks. At this stage, he said, Mrs. Carter may pursue civil remedies, criminal review, or conditional leniency. Jason's head snapped up. Leniency. There it was. The first genuine emotion stronger than greed. Fear mixed with hope. Mom, he whispered, and for one fragile second, I heard the child again. Not the man. The child. But age teaches you something painful. Love and accountability are not opposites. Sometimes love requires accountability, or it isn't love at all. I picked up my gloves slowly. You wanted me declared a burden, I said. So here is the burden you earned. I handed Harold my decision. Immediate removal of Jason and Vanessa from all discretionary trust benefits. Full forensic review. Mandatory repayment inquiry. And one condition that stopped Jason colder than any lawsuit. Maple Grove would not be sold. Ever. Instead, I would return home. With private in-home care, funded by my own estate. Not because I needed saving. But because I was done asking permission to remain in the life I built. Vanessa actually gasped. Jason just stared. But where are we supposed to go? He asked. And perhaps that was the most revealing question of all. Not, how do I fix this? Not, how do I make this right? Just, where do we go? I looked him dead in the eye. For the first time, without grief softening me. For once, I said, that is not my burden. I returned to Maple Grove on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. No moving trucks. No shouting. No police on the lawn. Just a black sedan Harold arranged, one signed release from Rosewood, and me, sitting in the back seat with Dorothy's parting words still fresh in my ears. Make them remember whose house it is. October sunlight spilled across the familiar streets as we turned onto Maple Grove Lane. My street. The oak tree Daniel planted when Jason was born still stood in the front yard, taller now. Stronger. Its branches stretched wide over the porch like time itself had been guarding the place while I was gone. For one dangerous second, I nearly cried. But then I saw the real estate sign. For sale, coming soon. My breath didn't catch. It hardened. Vanessa hadn't even waited. Harold noticed too. Bold, he muttered. No, I said quietly. Greedy. By the time the car stopped, my new in-home care coordinator, Mrs. Alvarez, was already beside me. Kind eyes, practical shoes, no nonsense. Exactly what I needed. Jason opened the front door before I reached it. He looked exhausted. Wrinkled shirt. Hollow eyes. Panicked as aged people quickly. Mom, please, he began. I didn't stop walking. Vanessa appeared behind him, still polished, though less invincible than before. This is all a misunderstanding. Harold stepped forward. No, he said. The misunderstanding was believing Mrs. Carter was uninformed. He handed them official injunction papers right there on Daniel's porch. Temporary freeze on property sale. Immediate suspension of unauthorized listing activity. Formal investigation into document fraud. Watching Vanessa's hand tremble for the first time was almost surreal. She had always been composed. Even at Daniel's funeral. Especially at Daniel's funeral. And suddenly, she wasn't. You can't do this, she snapped. I finally turned to her. In all our years, I had avoided direct confrontation. For Jason's sake. For peace. For the illusion of family. No. More. I already did. Simple. True. Liberating. I stepped past both of them and crossed my own threshold. Home smelled stale. Closed up. But beneath dust and expensive candle residue, it was still mine. My fingers brushed the hallway table Daniel built by hand. The family photos were still there, though interestingly, mine had been moved. Jason and Vanessa's vacation portrait now sat front and center. I picked it up. Looked at it once. Then set it face down. Mrs. Alvarez, efficient as sunrise, opened windows immediately. Fresh air poured through Maple Grove like the house itself had been holding its breath. Mom, Jason said again, following me inside. Where are we supposed to live? There it was. Again. Not apology. Not accountability. Logistics. I turned slowly in my own living room. The same room where I'd once stayed up sewing his Halloween costumes. The same fireplace where Daniel taught him how to hang Christmas stockings. And I realized something devastatingly simple. My son had not become cruel overnight. He had become entitled gradually, and I had mistaken it for love too many times. You have options, I said calmly. Sell your cars. Downsize. Rent. Work harder. Vanessa's face flushed crimson. You'd really do this to your own son? I looked around the home I had nearly lost. At Daniel's chair. At my wedding photo, now dusty. At 38 years of sacrifice. Then I gave her the only answer she deserved. No, I said. He did this to himself. That evening, locksmiths changed every exterior lock. Security codes were reset. Trust documents were secured in my study. And for the first time since Daniel died, I slept in my own bed. Alone, yes. But not abandoned. Because grief may have made me vulnerable. But betrayal had finally made me clear. The first lawsuit arrived on a Friday. Of course it did. Vanessa had always favored timing that disrupted peace. Mrs. Alvarez brought the envelope to me on a silver breakfast tray while I sat in Daniel's sunroom, still wearing my robe, watching autumn leaves gather along the back patio. Special delivery, she said carefully. I didn't even flinch. By then, I'd already learned something powerful. People who lose access to your kindness often call it cruelty. The filing was exactly what Harold predicted. Claims of elder manipulation, emotional instability, undue legal pressure. According to Vanessa's attorney, I had been coerced into changing estate protections by the very safeguards Daniel himself created. Creative. Desperate. But creative. Harold arrived before lunch, read the complaint once, then actually smiled. Not warmly. Sharply. Well, he said, setting it down. When people can't control assets, they often try to control narrative. I poured him coffee in Daniel's favorite mug, the navy one with the chipped handle. For some reason, that small familiar act steadied me more than any legal briefing could. Do they have a case? I asked. Harold took one sip. No. I appreciated the simplicity. But, he added, they do have enough desperation to embarrass themselves publicly. And embarrass themselves they did. Depositions began within weeks. Bank records. Signature analysis. Property filings. Email subpoenas. Vanessa, it turned out, had been remarkably confident in writing. There were messages. So many messages. To a realtor. Once Eleanor is permanently placed, we can move fast. To a friend. Jason feels guilty, but honestly, that house is wasted on one old woman. To Jason. Your mother won't understand half the paperwork anyway. I read every line. Not because I enjoyed pain, but because clarity is expensive, and I had already paid for mine. Jason's testimony was worse. Not malicious enough to sound monstrous. Just weak enough to sound true. He admitted Vanessa handled most details. Admitted he didn't fully read certain forms. Admitted they discussed future housing opportunities. Housing opportunities. What a bloodless phrase for stealing your mother's home. Still, for all his cowardice, there was one moment I did not expect. Under oath, when asked if he believed I was truly a burden, Jason cried. Not dramatically. Not strategically. Just broke. I thought, he said hoarsely, I thought moving her was temporary. Vanessa said it was safer. Easier. I didn't realize. I sat there in a tailored navy suit, Daniel's pearls at my throat, and finally understood something I should have years ago. My son's greatest failure was not cruelty. It was weakness. He had outsourced his conscience. And weakness, left unchecked, can destroy just as much as malice. Vanessa, meanwhile, remained exactly who she'd always been. Polished. Deflective. Blaming stress. Miscommunication. Concern. Until Harold presented Daniel's trust letter. The room changed after that. Because dead men, when wise enough, can still testify. Daniel's words were read into official record. Do not let guilt make you gentle with betrayal. Vanessa's expression finally cracked. Not into remorse. Into rage. And rage, when cornered by evidence, is often louder than innocence. By winter, the judge's preliminary ruling was clear. Fraud investigation proceeds. Trust protection stand. Property rights remain exclusively mine. Unauthorized filings voided. Jason and Vanessa were ordered to vacate Maple Grove's guest house extension within 30 days. 30 days. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Watching your child pack boxes from property you built is not victory. It is consequence. And consequence rarely feels clean. The day Jason came to collect the last of his things, he stood in the driveway holding a worn baseball glove. Daniel's old glove. Mom, he said, voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. I waited. For excuses. For pleas. For blame. Instead, he looked at the house, then at me. And finally asked the first honest question of his adult life. How did I become someone Dad needed to protect you from? That was the real burden. And for the first time, He was finally carrying it. Winter came quietly to Maple Grove. Not with drama. Not with slamming doors or courtroom speeches. Just frost on the porch railings Daniel built. Bare oak branches stretching over the yard. Morning light falling across rooms that finally felt honest again. For the first time since his death, I stopped surviving my life and began living it. Mrs. Alvarez helped me establish a rhythm. Medication at 7. Coffee in the sunroom at 8. Estate meetings twice a month. And every Thursday afternoon, I volunteered at Rosewood. Yes, Rosewood. The same nursing home. Where my son once left me with 2 suitcases and a rehearsed excuse. Funny how healing sometimes waits in the very place humiliation began. I didn't return because I had nowhere else to go. I returned because I wanted women like Dorothy to know abandonment was not the end of their story. By Christmas, we had started something small. A legal literacy group. Nothing fancy. Just tea, reading glasses, and a conference room full of women comparing paperwork, wills, account changes, and helpful relatives. You'd be amazed how many mothers were told, "It's just standard paperwork." You'd be horrified how often it wasn't. Dorothy called us the Burden Club. I kept the name. Seemed fitting. Jason called twice that winter. The first time, I let it ring. The second, I answered. Not because everything was repaired, but because boundaries and bitterness are not the same thing. His voice sounded older. Not aged by time. Aged by reckoning. He had moved into a modest rental outside town. Sold the luxury SUV. Taken extra consulting work. Vanessa, according to court filings, had moved in with her sister after blaming stress-related marital incompatibility. Interesting phrase. Consequences do have a way of clarifying compatibility. "Mom," he said, after a long silence, "I've been in counseling." I said nothing. Not to punish him. To let him continue without interruption. "I spent so much time blaming Vanessa," he admitted. "But I signed papers. I ignored things. I let convenience become character." That sentence. That was the first one that sounded like the son I once raised. Not innocent. Not absolved. But awake. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. I needed to tell you I see it now." Outside, snow began settling softly across Maple Grove's front lawn. I looked through the window at Daniel's oak tree, still standing, still rooted, even after storm after storm. "Seeing it," I said carefully, "is not the same as repairing it." "I know." And perhaps for the first time in years, he did. So I gave him what age had finally taught me, not easy grace. Not total exile. A door. Narrow. Conditional. Honest. "You may come for Sunday dinner," I said. "Once a month." "Alone." "No." "Paperwork." "No favors." "No entitlement." He cried then. Quietly. Like the little boy who once scraped his knee on our driveway and ran to me because he still believed mothers could fix pain. But some pain shouldn't be fixed too quickly. "Thank you," he whispered. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a while. Not sad. Not triumphant. Just clear. Because forgiveness, I was learning, is not pretending the wound never happened. It is deciding the wound does not get to own the rest of your life. That Sunday, I set the dining table for 2. Not 3. Daniel's chair remained untouched, as always. Some absences are sacred. When Jason arrived, he looked nervous. Simpler coat. No expensive watch. No Vanessa. Just my son. Older somehow. Smaller too. And when he stepped inside, he didn't act like an heir. He acted like a guest. Good. That was where rebuilding begins. Not with restored privilege, but with earned presence. Spring returned to Maple Grove the way grace often does. Quietly. Without announcement. Without apology. The snow melted from Daniel's oak tree. Daffodils pushed through the garden beds I had neglected during grief. The porch swing creaked again in the afternoon breeze, and little by little, the house stopped feeling like a battlefield. It became a home again. Not the same home. Not the naive one. But a truer one. By Easter, Sunday dinners with Jason had become less fragile. Still careful. Still earned. But different. He arrived early now. Brought groceries I didn't ask for. Fixed loose cabinet hinges without being told. Sat longer after dessert. Listened more than he spoke. Healing, I discovered, rarely looks dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a grown man quietly washing his late father's dinner plates because Shane finally taught him humility. We never pretended. That mattered. I did not erase Rosewood. I did not soften forged signatures into mistakes. I did not rewrite abandonment into misunderstanding just because repentance arrived later. No. Truth remained truth. But truth, when faced fully, can either destroy a family or rebuild one honestly. Vanessa's divorce from Jason finalized that summer. I won't pretend I celebrated. Brokenness is brokenness, even when accountability is deserved. But I also did not mourn the end of something built on manipulation. Jason did. And perhaps that was part of his education too. Some choices do not simply hurt others. They reveal who you become while making them. As for me, I expanded the Burden Club at Rosewood. What started as 6 women around folding tables became dozens. Widows. Retired teachers. Former nurses. Grandmothers. Women who had been dismissed, pressured, patronized, or quietly maneuvered toward irrelevance. We reviewed wills. Called attorneys. Checked deeds. Changed beneficiaries. And sometimes, we simply sat together and reminded one another that age does not erase authority. Dorothy, naturally, became vice president. Her business cards were entirely unnecessary and completely fabulous. One warm October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Jason left me at Rosewood, I hosted dinner at Maple Grove. Not as a test. Not as revenge. As closure. The table was set with my best china. Candles lit. Daniel's photograph rested at the center beside autumn leaves and white roses. Jason arrived alone. He stood in the doorway holding a pie from Miller's Diner, the same diner where I once worked double shifts so he could have the life he nearly threw away. I remembered, he said softly. And I believed him. After dinner, we sat on the porch beneath Daniel's oak tree, golden leaves drifting around us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Jason finally asked the question that had taken him a year to earn. Mom, do you think Dad would forgive me? I looked out across the yard Daniel built, the home he protected, the life I reclaimed. Then I answered with the only truth I knew. Your father loved deeply, I said. But love was never the same thing as avoiding consequences. Jason nodded, tears in his eyes. I know. And this time, he truly did. When he left that night, he hugged me differently. Not like a son claiming comfort. Like a man honoring it. I watched his car disappear down Maple Grove Lane, then looked up at the porch light glowing against the dark. Still on. Still mine. And I finally understood something I wish more women were told before life teaches it. Painfully, being a mother does not mean surrendering dignity. Growing older does not mean becoming disposable. And silence. Silence is not weakness when it is paired with wisdom. My son once sent me away because he believed I was a burden. But in the end, I gave him something heavier than guilt. I gave him accountability. I gave him the chance to become better. And I gave myself something far more important than revenge. I gave myself back my name. I am Eleanor Carter. I was never a burden. I was the foundation. And foundations should never be mistaken for something you can remove without watching everything collapse.